The House has resumed. Members, the House is considering the second reading of the Taxation GST Remedial Matters Bill. Craig Foss has the call. Should he wish to avail himself of the opportunity, is almost 5 minutes remaining. So him, in the absence of his call, is the member calling? Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Right.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this Taxation GST Remedial Matters Bill in its second reading. I enjoyed Peter Dunn, the Minister of Revenue speech, and I look forward to hearing it in a couple of years' time again. There are only three things that I wish to talk about tonight, Mr. Speaker. The first is that Labor will always support good legislation that promotes fairness and equity for all New Zealanders. The second is that Labor will always support good legislation that clamps down on tax evasion. And the third point is what a legislative necessity this bill actually is. And I see Mr. Bennett nodding. He was in the Select Committee. He knows what an important piece of legislation this is. Mr. Speaker, Labor always supports good tax legislation. We have supported the vast majority of tax bills through this House this session, but the type of bills that Labor does not support are the type of bills that give those 650 New Zealanders who are earning in excess of $1 million $1,000 a week in the hand, and the majority of New Zealanders who are earning the median wage less than $5 a week. Please be assured that we will never support tax legislation that does not promote fairness and equity. Mr. Speaker, this bill's headline provision is amendments to the Goods and Services Tax Act 1985 to provide for tax to be charged on supplies of land and transactions between registered persons at the rate of 0, to simplify the method for making adjustments for changes in use, and to streamline transactions involving nominated persons. In essence, Mr. Speaker, this is just another example of zero rating a GST transaction. But what I want to know is, where are the howls of derision and outrage from that side of the House over there, similar to those heard when Labor proposed to zero-rate GST on fresh fruit and vegetables? When Labor proposed a tax policy to actually help New Zealanders lead a healthy lifestyle. Well, there were no howls of derision when this involved a financial transaction, but there were when it was a healthy lifestyle transaction. Says something sad about the priorities, doesn't it, Sam? In fact, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of cases where there are zero-rated provisions in GST legislation. These include export goods, financial services, duty-free goods. In fact, there are about 17 categories of goods that can be zero-rated under certain circumstances. So when Labor proposed a policy to zero-rate fresh fruit and vegetables, this was not a bastardisation of the GST Act. This was in fact an act that promoted healthy choice, a policy that will be better for all New Zealanders. Now, Mr. Speaker, other policy and remedial amendments to this bill covers include the Income Tax Act 2007, Income Tax Act 2004, the Tax Administration Act 1994, Income Tax Act 1994, the KiwiSaver Act 2006, the Stamp and Cheque Duties Act 1971, Gaming Duties Act 1971, Local Government, Auckland Transitional Provisions Act 2010, and other regulations are also in this bill. So it's wide-ranging in its scope and reach. Its amendments are part of an ongoing process to improve legislative integrity, which is something everyone in this House wishes and works towards. But, Mr. Speaker, one can't go past a GST bill without bringing to this Parliament the views and the feedback from constituents on the implementation of the increase to GST to 15%. You know, that increase that Mr. Key said he wouldn't do? But he did. It's not good, Mr. Speaker. I've had many unhappy constituents say this is hurting New Zealanders. It is, quite frankly, a disgrace. And it all started when the Leader of the Opposition, one Mr John Key, stood up in front of the nation and laid our fears to rest by informing New Zealanders in their living room that no, he would not be raising GST if he became Prime Minister. In answer to a specific question from a reporter, and I quote, "Can you rule out raising GST to 15%? Mr Key replied, National will not be raising GST. End of quote. And if you do not believe me, you can go on YouTube and have a look. New Zealanders will remember. Mr Speaker, a large accountancy firm, Ernst & Young, in a press statement stated, many are realising this is not a modest increase. Mr Key did raise GST when he said he wouldn't. We will not forget those words nor his actions. Mr Speaker, my second point is that Labour will always support good legislation. This bill is a remedial matters bill. Remedial matters bills can play an important role in tidying up legislation and closing down holes or gaps that people and taxpayers may be exploiting. This is certainly the case with this bill. As mentioned, the main provision of interest in the bill is clamping down on tax evasion. We are a country that is founded on the principle of fairness and equity, and this certainly applies to tax. And Mr Speaker, this bill does promote these principles. There is something called a Phoenix fraud, where GST is refunded to a registered purchaser of land with no corresponding GST payment made by the vendor. As mentioned, this bill essentially zero rates most transactions involving land if both the purchaser and the vendor are GST registered. And I doubt there will be many in this country who would speak out against closing down a tax loophole being taken advantage of by unscrupulous property developers. There are other changes to this bill that this bill makes. These changes will not affect many people, but they are just as important. And those who they will affect do need to understand that the law will tighten up around these areas. They include, for example, the sharing of KiwiSaver member information. This bill amends the KiwiSaver Act 2006, and unfortunately it doesn't reinstate the provisions that were cut by that government, but it does amend the KiwiSaver Act and the Tax Administration Act to allow a member's address, date of birth and ID number and IRD number to be shared between their scheme provider and the Land Revenue. On-premises fringe benefit tax exemption. Now, Mr Speaker, we debated this at length in the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee because the bill, as it was presented to the committee, wanted to make this retrospective. In the committee's wisdom, we decided that retrospective tax legislation was only to be used in very, very rare circumstances, and this was not one of these. We decided that we would let the courts determine if people had actually acted within the law or outside the law. There is the provisions around joint bank accounts, and we argued and debated this at length. Their application for overseas donee status, for example, you can now donate money to the Mutamina Charitable Trust and the Bougainville Library Trust. We talked about Auckland Council restructuring, tax treatment of emission trading units, and a number of other amendments to different bills. But to sum up, Mr Speaker, I spoke about two key themes. Labour will support any legislation, and especially any tax legislation, that is fair and equitable for all New Zealanders, and certainly legislation that closes down tax evasion opportunities, and this bill does that. The second point was that this bill is important because it makes a series of changes necessary to preserve the integrity of the tax system. This is a good bill, Mr Speaker. The Finance and Expenditure Committee agreed on every aspect of the bill. We made some good changes. It is good law. That is why I'm supporting it. Thank you very much.